In the shadows between histories, certainties, lies a darker truth, that some disappearances cut so deep they wound the very soul of memory itself. Tonight, we walk among the vanished, those whose absence echoes louder than any presence, whose silence has become England's most haunting song. The year was 1066, and the world was ending, on the 14th day of October, beneath a sky that wept. With autumn rain, two armies met at Hastings. The earth trembled under the weight of destiny as Norman cavalry thundered against the shield wall of Anglo-Saxon England. By evening, when the last war cry faded into the gathering dark, one kingdom lay dying in the mud, while another was being born in blood. But in the aftermath of that terrible day, as survivors stumbled through fields carpeted with the dead, a mystery began that would haunt England's dreams for 1,000 years. Harold Godwinson, last king of the Anglo-Saxons, had vanished. Not just his crown, not just his throne, but his very flesh had disappeared from the world, leaving behind a wound in history that has never healed. The battle had raged from dawn until dusk, a grinding horror of steel and sinew. Harold's housecarls, those legendary warriors bound by oath and honor, had formed their wall of shields atop Senlac Hill. Behind them flew the fighting man banner, its golden thread catching the pale October light. They had stood like stones against the Norman tide, these last guardians of an England that was already becoming memory. William the Bastard, soon to be called Conqueror, had hurled his cavalry again and again against that stubborn line. The feigned retreats, the rain of arrows, the desperate charges, all the craft of war was employed that day. And somewhere in those blood-soaked hours, as legend tells, an arrow found its mark in a royal eye, and Harold Godwinson fell. But then came the darkness, and with it the mystery. When dawn broke over the killing field, the Normans began their grim harvest of victory. They stripped the dead of armor and gold, gathering the bodies of their own for burial while leaving their enemies to rot under the English sky. Among the Saxon dead lay earls and thanes, farmers and merchants, all equal now in the democracy. Of death, yet of Harold himself, there was no trace. The chronicles speak in hushed, uncertain tones of what happened next. Some say that Edith Swanneck, Harold's beloved mistress, came searching among the corpse-strewn field. She had known his body as intimately as she knew her own soul-every scar from old battles, every mark that years had carved upon his flesh. Through the morning mist she wandered, lifting faces bloated with death, seeking the man who had been her king and her heart. Did she find him? The stories fracture here, splitting like light through broken glass. One chronicle whispers, yes, that she recognized him despite the terrible wounds, identified him by secret marks known only to her touch. She wrapped him in precious cloth, they say, and bore him away for burial in some forgotten place, taking the location of his grave to her own tomb. But other voices speak different truths. The monks of Waltham Abbey, where Harold had prayed before marching to his doom, claimed that he came to them not as a corpse but as a penitent. In their telling, the king had survived Hastings, crawling from the field more dead than alive, his face so ruined by wounds that none could know him. He had sought sanctuary in their abbey, they whispered, living out his days as a nameless hermit, serving God in the shadow of his own legend. These monks spoke of a broken man who tended their gardens in silence, who knelt in prayer with tears streaming down scars that might once have been a royal face. They said he never spoke his name, never claimed his past, but sometimes in the depths of winter nights, they would find him standing before Harold's own foundation stone, his lips moving in soundless confession to the ghost of the king he had been. Yet even this tale dissolves when held too closely to the light, for William the Conqueror himself seemed haunted by Harold's absence. The Norman duke, now king by right of conquest, had promised to display the body of his rival as proof of victory. He had sworn to show England that their king was truly dead. That resistance was not merely futile, but finished. Instead, he found only shadows and whispers. Some said William ordered the body destroyed, burned to ash, and scattered on the wind so that no shrine could grow around Harold's bones. The pragmatic cruelty of this rings true. What conqueror would allow his predecessor's grave to become a pilgrimage site for rebellion? Better to erase him entirely, to make his very existence questionable. But others whispered darker possibilities. They spoke of Harold's body being cast into the sea, weighted with stones, and fed to the fish so that even the earth would not receive him. Some claimed the Normans buried him in secret, unmarked ground, with only William himself knowing the location and knowledge he carried to his own grave, ensuring that Harold's rest would remain forever disturbed. The mystery deepened with each passing year. Pilgrims would come to supposed grave sites. Each claimed to hold the true remains of the last Saxon king. Waltham Abbey eventually produced a tomb, but was it genuine remembrance or desperate hope given form? The stones offered no answers, only the cold comfort of finality that might be nothing more than wishful stone. In the ballads that grew like flowers from the blood-soaked earth of Hastings, Harold became something more than mortal king. He was the wounded land itself, the England that Norman conquest could claim but never truly possess. His vanishing became a metaphor for a whole way of life that had been swept away, the Saxon world of hall and hearth, of kings who fought beside their men and died with their shields in their hands. The singers told of Harold walking still through the mists of morning, his ghostly crown visible to those who remembered what England had been before the Normans came. They sang of him appearing to rebels and dreamers, blessing their resistance with his presence before fading back into the space between memory and hope. Perhaps this is why his body was never found, because Harold Godwinson had become something that flesh could not contain. But a vanished king belongs to legend, and legends cannot be conquered. Even now, nearly 1,000 years since that October evening when England's fate was sealed in blood, the absence of Harold's grave feels like an open wound in the landscape. Somewhere in the gentle hills of Sussex, perhaps beneath a forgotten church, or lost in some ancient wood, the bones of the last Saxon king may still be waiting. Or perhaps they never will be found, because some mysteries are meant to endure. Some silences are more eloquent than any stone marker could ever be. The mist still rises from the battlefield at Hastings, and sometimes, in the hour before dawn, when the world stands balanced between night and day, travelers speak of seeing a figure in the fog, tall and proud, bearing wounds that never heal, searching eternally for a kingdom that exists now only in the space between memory and dreams. Harold Godwinson, last king of the Anglo-Saxons, forever vanished, forever present, forever walking. The borderland between history and myth. His disappearance reminds us that some losses are too profound for graves to contain, some endings too vast for monuments to measure. In vanishing, Harold became the voice of everyone who has ever been erased by conquest, the presence that haunts every absence, the king whose true kingdom was built not of earth and stone, but of the undying human need to remember what was lost deep in the heart of ancient Germania, where the trees grow thick as cathedral pillars and the mist clings to earth like the breath of sleeping gods. There stands a forest that remembers blood. The Teutoburg, they called it, the name that would become a whisper of warning, a caution against the hubris of empires. For it was here, in the year 9 of the Common Era, that Rome learned that even eagles can fall, that even the most disciplined legions can vanish into shadow as completely as if they had never drawn breath. The story begins, not in the forest itself, but in the marble halls of Rome, where Augustus Caesar ruled an empire that stretched from the Scottish mists to the sands of Africa. Rome in those days believed itself eternal, its eagles destined to perch upon every mountaintop, its legions ordained to bring order to a chaotic world. Germania represented the final frontier wildlands populated by tribes the Romans saw as barely more than beasts, ripe for the civilizing touch of Roman law and Roman steel. 3 legions marched into those German woods in the autumn of that year, their armor gleaming like silver scales in the filtered sunlight that penetrated the canopy. The 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, comprising 5,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, accompanied by auxiliary troops and camp followers. In total, perhaps 20,000 souls followed the eagle's standards into the depths of the Teutoburg, confident in their superiority, certain of their destiny. Their commander was Publius Quinctilius Verus, a man whose name would become synonymous with catastrophe. Verus had governed Syria with reasonable success, accumulating wealth and favor in the way that provincial governors did. Romania seemed a natural progression, in other barbarous land to be pacified, another jewel to add to Rome's crown. He carried with him not just the authority of the legions, but the absolute certainty that Roman discipline would triumph over German savagery. But the forest was watching, and the forest had eyes. Among Verus's trusted advisers walked a young German nobleman named Arminius. Rome had taken him as a boy, educated him in their ways, granted him citizenship and military rank. He spoke Latin like a native, understood Roman tactics better than many Roman officers, and had sworn oaths of loyalty that seemed as solid as bronze to Verus. Arminius represented the future of Germania native leader who had embraced Roman trephalization and could help bring his people into the empire's warm embrace. The irony would have been beautiful if it had not been written in so much blood. As autumn deepened and the leaves began their slow descent toward earth, Verus received reports of a rebellion among distant German tribes. It was nothing serious, Arminius assured him, a minor uprising that could be quelled quickly if the legions showed their strength. The route would take them through the Teutoburg Forest, along paths that Arminius knew well from his youth. It would be, he promised, a demonstration of Roman power that would prevent future troubles. And so the legions marched, their sandals marking steady rhythm on the forest floor, their standards bright against the darkening trees. They moved in the loose formation that long experience had taught them, not the tight battle order of open ground, but the extended column necessary for forest travel. Supply wagons creaked along the narrow paths, laden with the tools of Roman civilization, siege engines, surveying equipment, the portable apparatus of conquest. The forest closed around them like a living thing. For 3 days they penetrated deeper into the woods, following paths that grew ever narrower, ever more treacherous. The weather turned, as autumn weather will, and cold rain began to fall in sheets that turned the earth to sucking mud and made every step a struggle. The neat Roman column began to stretch and fragment, units becoming separated by the terrain and the conditions. It was then that the forest began to whisper. The attacks came not as a single battle, but as a series of ambushes, each more devastating than the last. German warriors materialized from behind trees and vanished again like smoke, their spears finding targets before the Romans could even locate their attackers. The column, stretched thin by the terrain, could not form proper battle lines. Units found themselves cut off, surrounded, overwhelmed by enemies who seemed to know every tree, every stone, every shadow in those woods. Arminius, the trusted guide, had vanished in the first hours of fighting. Some said they saw him among the German warriors, his Roman armor cast aside, his loyalty revealed as the elaborate deception it had always been. Others claimed he had been killed in the initial confusion, another victim of Germanic treachery. But those who survived the longest whispered that they had heard his voice calling out commands to the attackers, orchestrating the destruction of the men who had trusted him. For 3 days and nights the massacre continued. Not a battles, have order, strategy, the possibility of victory or defeat. This was an extermination, methodical and complete. The Germans had prepared the forest itself as a weapon, blocking paths with fallen trees, digging hidden pits, turning every clearing into a killing ground. The legions died as they had lived, with discipline and courage, but also with the growing understanding that their discipline was useless here, their courage meaningless against an enemy that refused to fight by Roman rules. Veterans who had conquered Gaul and subdued the German tribes found themselves helpless in woods that twisted familiar tactics into death traps. Varus himself, seeing the complete collapse of his forces, chose the Roman solution to intolerable defeat. He fell upon his sword rather than face the shame of capture. His last act, a gesture toward the honor that his poor judgment had already forfeited. His officers followed his example, one by one, until the forest floor was carpeted with the bodies of Rome's finest. But death was not the end of the horror, was only the beginning. When the killing was finished, when the last Roman voice had been silenced, the Germans began their rituals. They took the eagle standards, those sacred symbols of Roman power, and desecrated them in ways that would have made seasoned legionaries weep. They hung the captured officers from trees, their bodies left to rot as offerings to the forest gods. The skulls of centurions were nailed to oak trunks, creating grotesque trophies that would grin down at travelers for years to come. Most terrible of all, they took the survivors, for there were always a few who lived, hidden in thickets or buried beneath the bodies of their comrades, sacrificed them in the sacred groves. Roman discipline had taught these men to face death in battle with stoic courage. But the forest demanded different deaths, slower and more terrible deaths that fed the hungry earth with Roman blood and Roman screams. The forest swallowed it, all the blood, the bones, the very memory of what had been. In less than a week, 20,000 Roman soldiers had simply vanished, as if they had never existed. No messengers escaped to carry word of the disaster. No survivors straggled back to tell their tale. The legions had marched into the trees and disappeared as completely as morning mist. In Rome, Augustus waited for news that never came. Weeks passed, then months. The silence from Germania grew ever more ominous. But Rome was vast, and communications were slow. Perhaps Varus was simply taking his time, ensuring that his pacification of the province was complete. Perhaps the German winter had delayed his reports. It was only when the spring came, and still brought no word, that Rome began to understand the magnitude of what had been lost. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, their numbers, were never used again, as if by acknowledging their existence, Rome would have to acknowledge their destruction. 3 eagles lost, 20,000 men vanished, a province abandoned in a single catastrophic stroke. The news, when it finally reached Rome, broke Augustus like a physical blow. The emperor, who had conquered Egypt and tamed the Mediterranean, was said to have wandered his palace for days, beating his head against the walls and crying out, Quinctili Vaur, Legiones Retha, Varus, give me back my legions. But the forest had swallowed them too completely for any mortal power to call them back. For 6 years, Rome sent no more armies across the Rhine. The wound was too deep, the loss too absolute. When they finally returned, it was not to conquer, but to locate the bones of the vanished legions and give them proper burial. What they discovered in those woods defied description. Altars built from Roman armor, groves decorated with the skulls of their countrymen, clearings where the earth was still black with ancient blood. But of the legions themselves, the men who had marched so proudly into the forest, they found almost nothing. A few scattered bones, some fragments of equipment, the occasional coin glinting in the leaf mold. The forest had digested them, absorbed them, made them part of its own dark substance. The Teutoburg had become their tomb, but it was a tomb without graves, a memorial without monuments. The surviving accounts speak of German prisoners who claimed the forest spirits had taken the legions, drawn them down into the earth to serve as guardians of the sacred groves. Others whispered that the Romans still marched somewhere in the depths of the woods, undead sentinels doomed to patrol eternally the paths of their own destruction. On certain nights, when the mist rose thick and the wind moved through the branches, with sounds like clashing steel, local tribes claimed they could hear the phantom legions still calling their cadence, still trying to find their way home. The Teutoburg disaster became more than a military defeat. It became a wound in Rome's sense of itself, a reminder that even the greatest empires are mortal. The forest had taught Rome that its eagles could be broken, its discipline could be overcome, its soldiers could vanish without trace. In swallowing 3 legions, the woods had devoured something of Rome's soul. Medieval chroniclers, writing centuries later, when Rome itself was only memory, would tell the tale as a moral fable. Empire, they warned, was hubris made flesh, and hubris always found its forest, always met its Arminius, always learned that some dark places would not be conquered. The vanished legions became symbols of every overreach punished, every pride humbled, every civilization that believed itself eternal, only to discover that forests are older than empires and infinitely more patient. Today, tourists walk sanitized paths through the Teutoburg, reading plaques that explain the historical significance of what happened in those woods 2,000 years ago. But sometimes, when the mist rises and the shadows grow long, the forest remembers. Sometimes, in the hour before dawn, hikers speak of hearing sounds that might be wind through the branches, or might be the ghostly echo of hobnailed sandals on ancient paths as three lost legions continue their eternal march toward a home they will never see. The earth keeps its secrets well, but the Teutoburg keeps them best of all. Somewhere beneath the peaceful German soil lie the bones of 20,000 Romans, their final resting place, known only to the trees that have grown fat on their remains. They marched into the forest as conquerors and vanished into legend. Their disappearance, a reminder that some mysteries are written in blood and sealed with silence, and that even the mightiest eagles sometimes fall so far that no amount of searching can ever bring them home. In the gentle hills of Somerset, where apple trees have bloomed for 1,000 springs and mist rises like incense from ancient marshes, there stands an abbey that holds more secrets than stones. Glastonbury, they call it, now a name that rolls off the tongue like honey, sweet with the memory of miracles. But in the shadow of its great tower, in the whispered prayers that echo through its ruins, there dwells a story that turns that sweetness dark as winter wine. The year was 946, when the world still believed in thin places where heaven touched earth and angels walked among men. Brother Benedict was the abbot then, a man whose sanctity was spoken of in hushed reverence from the courts of kings to the humblest peasant cottages. Under his guidance, Glastonbury had become more than an abbeyate, had become a beacon of divine light in a world still half-wrapped in pagan shadows. But on the morning of the feast of St. Michael, as the first pale fingers of dawn crept across the marshlands, Brother Benedict walked into the mist and vanished from the world as completely as if he had never drawn breath. The abbey had awakened that September morning to the sound of bells calling the brothers to prime the first prayer of the day. In the gray hour before sunrise, when the boundary between night and day grows thin as gossamer, the monks filed into their chapel with the quiet devotion of men who had given their lives to God. But the abbot's stall stood empty, its silence more profound than any absence should have been. Brother Francis, the prior, felt the first stirring of unease as he looked upon that vacant seat. Benedict was a man of such rigid devotion that illness itself seemed to bend before his will. Never in all his years as abbot had he missed the dawn prayer. Never had his voice failed to join the ancient Latin words that welcomed each new day. The very stones of the chapel seemed to hold their breath in the wrongness of his absence. When prime was finished and the community dispersed to their morning labors, Brother Francis knocked upon the abbot's door. The sound echoed strangely in the corridor, as if the very air had grown thick and strange. There was no answer, only the kind of silence that speaks of emptiness, of spaces where life should dwell but does not. The door was not locked. Benedict had never felt the need for locks in God's house. Brother Francis pushed it open to find the cell exactly as it should be. The simple bed made with military precision, the wooden crucifix hanging straight upon the wall, the prayer book closed, and waiting on the small table, but of the abbot himself there was no sign. His sandals sat beside the bed, as if he had simply stepped out of them and ascended bodily to heaven. It was then that Brother Francis noticed something that made his blood run cold as marsh water. The window stood open, though Benedict was known to keep it shuttered against the night vapors. Beyond the casement, the morning mist hung so thick it seemed solid, a wall of gray that swallowed the world beyond the abbey walls. Search began immediately, with a methodical thoroughness born of desperation. Every corner of the abbey was examined, every cell and corridor, every nook where a man might have fallen ill or met with accident. The brothers combed the grounds with the intensity of men seeking their own souls, calling Benedict's name until their voices grew hoarse and the echoes seemed to mock their efforts. Brother Thomas, the youngest of the community, claimed to have seen the abbot the previous evening, walking in the apple orchard, as was his custom after The old man had seemed troubled, Thomas said, pausing often to gaze westward toward the Tor, that strange hill that rose from the marshland like a sleeping giant. Something in his manner had struck the young monk as otherworldly, as if Benedict saw things invisible to younger eyes. As the day wore on and still brought no sign of their missing abbot, the search expanded beyond the abbey walls. The marshes of Somerset in those days were treacherous places, full of hidden pools and sucking mud that could swallow a man before he could cry for help. Perhaps Benedict had fallen into one of these water graves, claimed by the earth that had nurtured so many saints. The brothers waded into the fog-shrouded wetlands, their robes kilted up like peasant workers, their prayers mixing with the calls of marsh birds. They probed every pool, examined every hummock of solid ground, followed every path that pilgrims used to reach the abbey. But the marshes yielded nothing except the ancient silence of places where water and land meet in eternal negotiation. By evening, when the fog began to lift and the first stars appeared like distant candles, a terrible possibility began to whisper itself in the minds of the searching monks. Brother Benedict had not simply wandered away or met with accident. He had been taken, but by whom or what remained a mystery as thick as the morning mist itself. Brother Matthew, the abbey's chronicler, spoke in hushed tones of the old stories, the tales that Christian teaching was supposed to have banished, but which still lurked in the corners of peasant memory. The marshlands of Somerset, he reminded them, had been sacred to the old gods long before Christ's light had reached these shores. The ancient Britons had spoken of the other world, that realm of spirits and fey-folk that lay just beyond the veil. Of ordinary sight, could it be, he wondered, in the darkest hour of that first night, that the mist had been more than mere weather? The old tales spoke of fog that was not fog, but a gateway, a passage between the world of men and the realm of beings who had ruled these lands before the Romans came, before the Saxons conquered, before the cross had been planted in British soil. Other brothers, their faith more orthodox, but their fear no less real, spoke of divine mysteries beyond human understanding. Had God taken Benedict as he had taken Enoch and Elijah, drawing his faithful servant directly to heaven without the intermediary of death? The thought brought comfort to some, but others found it more terrifying than any earthly explanation. If God could simply pluck a man from the world without warning, without preparation, what safety did any of them have? As days passed into weeks, Other possibilities emerged, each more disturbing than the last. Brother Paul, who kept the abbey's accounts, spoke quietly of recent tensions with the local nobility. There were those who coveted Glastonbury's wealth, who saw the abbey's growing influence as a threat to their own power. Could Benedict have been murdered, his body hidden so perfectly that no trace remained? The thought that their abbot might have died violently, alone and unshire even, brought a special horror to the community. But even this explanation, terrible as it was, seemed inadequate to the mystery. If Benedict had been killed by human enemies, surely some sign would remain: blood on stone, torn cloth caught on thorns, some trace of struggle or haste. The complete absence of any evidence began to seem more unnatural than any supernatural explanation. It was Brother Simon, the abbey's anchorite, who lived alone in a cell by the eastern wall, who offered the most disturbing possibility of all. Simon spoke to few people, spending his days in prayer and contemplation, but the brothers knew him to be a man of unusual insight, touched perhaps by the same divine grace that he spent his life seeking. In the 3rd week after Benedict's disappearance, Simon broke his customary silence to share a vision that had come to him in prayer. He had seen, he said, the abbot standing at the edge of the known world, at the place where the mist meets the eternal. Benedict was not dead in Simon's vision, but neither was he alive in any sense that mortal men could understand. He had become something else: a guardian of thresholds, a keeper of the spaces between worlds. The vision spoke of Benedict choosing this fate, walking deliberately into the mist, not because he was called by God or taken by enemies, but because he had seen something in the darkness ahead that required a sacrifice. Some evil was stirring in the hidden places of the world, something that threatened not just Glastonbury, but all the Christian lands. To stand against it, to hold the barrier between light and dark, Benedict had accepted a kind of exile more complete than death itself. Brother Simon's words brought a strange comfort to the community, but they also deepened the mystery. If Benedict had chosen his fate, why had he given no sign, left no word of explanation? How could a man simply decide to step out of the world, abandoning his brothers and his sacred duties, without even a farewell? The answer, when it came, arrived not as revelation, but as discovery. A month after the abbot's disappearance, as the first autumn storms began to lash the marshlands, a young shepherd boy found something strange in the mud beside a distant pool. It was Benedict's staff, the carved ash wood that he had carried for 20 years as the symbol of his authority. But it was not simply lost or dropped, it had been planted upright in the soft earth, as deliberate as a boundary marker. When the brothers came to examine this discovery, they found something that made their flesh crawl with supernatural dread. The staff had not been pushed into the mud by human hands. It had taken root. Green shoots were already beginning to sprout from the ancient wood, as if the earth itself was claiming Benedict's authority, transforming it into something wild and strange. Around the staff, pressed deep into the marsh mud, were footprints that might have been Benedict's, but they led only to the water's edge and then simply stopped. Not disappeared, not obscured by later traffic, but stopped, as if the man who made them had simply ceased to exist at that precise spot. The brothers took the rooted staff back to the abbey, where it was placed in the chapel as a memorial to their vanished abbot. But even in that sacred space, the thing continued to grow, its impossible leaves rustling with no wind to move them. Some of the monks swore they could hear whispers in that rustling, words in a language that might have been Latin or might have been something far older. Years passed, and Benedict's disappearance became part of Glastonbury's mythology, a story told to pilgrims alongside the tales of Arthur and the Holy Grail. But unlike those other legends, this one brought no comfort, no sense of divine purpose fulfilled. The empty abbot's stall remained empty, not from respect, but from a deep reluctance to claim a seat that might still be occupied by something invisible. The staff continued to grow, slowly but inexorably, until it became a small tree that the monks learned to tend with nervous reverence. Its leaves never fell, its wood never showed signs of age or decay. Pilgrims would sometimes claim to see a figure standing beneath its branches in the early morning hours, a tall man in a brown habit, his face hidden by shadow, his presence both comforting and terrible. To this day, in the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey, there grows a tree that cannot be explained by any natural law. Botanists have examined it, taken samples, tried to classify its species, but the answers always slip away like morning mist. The local people call it Benedict's tree, and they speak of it in whispers, the way their ancestors spoke of sacred groves and fairy rings. Sometimes, when the mist rises thick from the Somerset marshes and the world grows thin at the edges, visitors to the abbey report seeing things that cannot quite be explained. A figure in brown robes walking among the ruins, a voice joining the wind in something that might be prayer, footprints in the mud that lead nowhere and come from nothing. The mystery of Brother Benedict's disappearance remains as impenetrable as the mist that swallowed him, a reminder that even in our age of reason and science, there are still thin places in the world where the impossible becomes inevitable. His vanishing speaks to every soul that has ever wondered about the spaces between what we know and what we fear, about the price of standing guard at the edges of mystery. In walking into that September mist, Benedict stepped out of history and into legend, but it was a dark legend, a story without resolution or comfort. His absence continues to haunt Glastonbury like an unanswered prayer, a question posed to heaven that has received only silence in reply. Perhaps that silence is the answer. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some disappearances are meant to echo through time as reminders that the world holds depths we cannot fathom and mists we dare not enter. The abbey keeps its vigil still, and somewhere in the space between memory and myth, Benedict keeps his in the blood-soaked chronicles of the First Crusade, where holy war and earthly ambition danced their terrible waltz across the ancient lands of the East. Few names carried more weight than Hugh of Vermandois, brother to the King of France, bearer of the sacred banner, first among the great lords to take the cross. He was called Hugh the Great, and in the fever dreams of crusading fervor, he seemed touched by divine purpose. Yet his story ends not in triumph or martyrdom, but in a silence so complete it swallows even the memory of his passing. The year was 1096, when Hugh first heard the call that would define his destiny. Pope Urban's words at Clermont had set Europe ablaze with religious passion, and from every castle and cottage came the cry, Deus vult, God wills it. The Holy Land, held for centuries by Muslim rulers, would be reclaimed for Christendom. It was to be a war unlike any other, blessed by heaven itself, promising salvation to all who took up the cross. Hugh was among the first to answer that call, driven by a mixture of genuine piety and the restless ambition that ran in royal blood. As brother to Philip I of France, he had power but not a throne, wealth but not ultimate authority. The crusade offered him something precious beyond gold, or landed offered him a kingdom of his own making, carved from the sacred earth of Palestine. By sword and prayer, the journey itself became the stuff of legend. Hugh gathered around him a host of knights and nobles, their armor gleaming with fresh blessing, their hearts burning with the certainty of righteous purpose. They marched through the kingdoms of Europe like a river of steel and prayer, leaving behind wives and children, lands and titles, everything that bound them to the world they knew. But the road to Jerusalem was paved with more than good intentions. In the wild lands beyond Constantinople, where Byzantine politics mixed with barbarian raids and religious fervor curdled into fanaticism, Hugh learned that God's war was still war, and war devoured the holy and the damned with equal appetite. The siege of Antioch broke men like straw. For months, the Crusader host sat before those massive walls, starving and dying, while their enemies watched from the ramparts above. Disease ravaged the camps, turning prayer into delirium and faith into desperate bargaining with a God who seemed to have turned his face away. It was there, in that crucible of suffering, that Hugh proved himself not just a nobleman playing at soldier, but a true leader of men. When the city finally fell, when the gates opened and Christian soldiers poured through the streets in an orgy of conquest and revenge, Hugh was among the first to plant his banner on Antioch's walls. The victory was complete, terrible, and transformative. The boy who had left France seeking glory had become a man baptized in blood and fire, tempered by suffering into something harder and stranger than the court of his royal brother had ever imagined. Jerusalem itself was almost an anticlimax after Antioch. The holy city fell to the Crusaders like ripe fruit, its defenders overwhelmed by men who believed themselves instruments of divine will. Hugh knelt at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, with tears streaming down his face, touching his sword too, the stone where Christ had supposedly lain, fulfilling the dream that had carried him across half the world. But dreams, once achieved, the Crusader states were carved up among the great lords, and Hugh found himself with less than he had hoped for. His claims diminished by the political realities of men who had survived where others had died. The Holy Land, it turned out, was still land, still requiring the same mundane work of governance and diplomacy that he had left France to escape. In 1100, Hugh returned to Europe, his great adventure concluded, his soul scarred by things no amount of prayer could heal. He had seen the face of war behind its holy mask, had learned that even God's warriors could be as cruel and petty as any bandits. The man who came home was not the man who had left, and those who knew him spoke of a change that went deeper than the physical marks of campaign. For 6 years, Hugh lived quietly on his French estates, managing his lands and tending to the business of peace. But the call of the East never entirely left him. Letters came from the Crusader kingdoms, speaking of new threats, of Muslim armies gathering to reclaim what had been taken, of the need for Christian reinforcement. The cross, once taken, could never quite be set aside. In 1106, Hugh announced his intention to return to the Holy Land. The decision surprised those who knew him. He had served his time, earned his salvation, paid his debt to God and duty. But something in those distant kingdoms called to him, some unfinished business that would not let him rest. Perhaps it was guilt over comrades left buried in foreign soil, or perhaps it was the restless ambition that had driven him from the first, or perhaps, as some whispered, it was something darker, kind of spiritual hunger that could only be fed in the places where heaven and hell met in open war. 7 prayer books lay open on the stone floor, their pages fluttering in the wind that moved through the open doors. 7 sets of personal belongings, rosaries, small knives for cutting quills, precious prayer oils, were arranged with a kind of precision that spoke of deliberate placement rather than hasty departure. 7 indentations in the thin layer of snow showed where knees had pressed to stone, as if the sisters had been kneeling in prayer when whatever happened to them occurred. But of the 7 nuns themselves there was no sign, not a thread of fabric, not a strand of hair, not even a footprint to show which direction they might have gone. The search began immediately. With a thoroughness born of desperate love, Abbess Matilda commanded every corner of the abbey to be examined, every cell and corridor, every storage room and hidden passage that centuries of construction had created in the ancient walls. The sisters combed their grounds like women possessed, calling the names of their vanished companions until their voices cracked with strain as word of the disappearance spread beyond the abbey walls. The search expanded to include the surrounding countryside. The local nobility, many of whom had daughters or sisters among the nuns, sent armed men to scour the forests and villages. The idea that 7 noblewomen could simply vanish from consecrated ground was so appalling that secular and religious authorities united in their determination to find answers. But the winter landscape yielded nothing. The Rhine was too frozen for bodies to have been thrown into its current. The forests showed no signs of passage, no broken branches or disturbed snow to indicate that anyone had fled through the trees. The roads were watched by guards who swore no group of women had traveled their routes in recent days. It was then that the whispers began, creeping through the community like poison in the blood. Sister Margaret, eldest of the remaining nuns, spoke in hushed tones of strange lights that had been seen in the chapel during the weeks before the disappearance. Not the warm glow of candles or the steady radiance of oil lamps, but cold, blue flames that danced without consuming anything, that cast no shadows, but seemed to pull light from the world around them. Others remembered how the 7 vanished. Sisters had become increasingly secretive in their devotions, spending long hours in prayer, but speaking little of what they sought in their communion with the divine. Sister Agnes claimed to have overheard fragments of Latin that sounded like no prayers she recognized, words that seemed to twist in the mouth and make the air itself feel heavy with unnamed presence. The most disturbing testimony came from Sister Clothilde, the abbey's librarian, who had discovered that several ancient texts were missing from the collection. These were not the common books of devotion that any nun might consult, but rare manuscripts that dealt with the more esoteric aspects of Christian mysticism. Some spoke of direct communion with angels, others of the thin places where the physical world touched realms beyond mortal understanding. As winter deepened and still brought no trace of the missing sisters, darker possibilities began to surface. The Abbey of Essen sat on ancient ground, land that had been sacred long before Christian missionaries brought the cross to Germanic tribes. Local peasants spoke in whispers of old gods who might reclaim what had once been theirs, of sacrifices that opened doorways between worlds. The official investigation, led by representatives of both the emperor and the church, found evidence that seemed to support supernatural explanations. In the chapel where the sisters had last been seen, scholars discovered markings carved into the stone floor symbols that predated Christian iconography by centuries. These had been carefully hidden beneath a layer of mortar, but whatever had happened on that winter night had cracked the covering, revealing signs that made learned men cross themselves and speak in worried whispers of things that should have remained buried. More disturbing still was the discovery of what appeared to be a hidden chamber beneath the chapel altar. Access was gained only by moving stones that should have required the strength of several men. Yet the chamber showed signs of recent use. Strange implements were found, their bronze bowls, tarnished black with age, knives whose metal held a blue sheen that hurt the eyes to look upon, and books written in scripts that no scholar could identify. The official conclusion was that the 7 nuns had been engaged in heretical practices, possibly involving communication with demonic forces. This explanation satisfied the political requirements of both church and empire. It removed the taint of divine displeasure from the abbey, while providing a cautionary tale about the dangers of straying from orthodox devotion. But those who knew the missing sisters found this explanation hollow as winter wind. These had been women of genuine holiness, whose lives had been devoted to God with a purity that shamed many of their ordained male counterparts. If they had fallen into heresy, it was a heresy born not of corruption, but of a desire to serve their Creator more perfectly than mortal flesh typically allowed. Alternative theories flourished in the dark corners of monastic life. Some whispered that the 7 had achieved a form of mystical translation, their bodies transformed or transported by the intensity of their devotion. This would explain the careful arrangement of their belongings, the precision with which they seemed to have prepared for their departure from the material world. Others spoke of ancient pacts that bound certain bloodlines to powers older than Christianity. Several of the vanished nuns came from families whose noble lineages stretched back to the time of Charlemagne and beyond, bloodlines that might carry obligations inherited from ancestors who had bargained with forces that Christian baptism could not entirely wash away. The most persistent rumors concerned visions that had supposedly been granted to various sisters in the weeks before the disappearance. These dreams spoke of a great work that required 7 pure souls, a task that could only be accomplished by women who had dedicated their lives entirely to the divine. In these visions, the sisters were called to serve as bridges between heaven and earth. Their combined prayers, opening a pathway for divine grace to enter a world grown dark with sin. Whether this great work required their physical presence or only their spiritual essence was never made clear. But those who believed these accounts saw the disappearance not as tragedy, but as the ultimate fulfillment of religious vocation's 7 souls, so purified by devotion that they had been deemed worthy to serve God in ways that flesh could not sustain. Years passed, and the empty cells in the Abbey of Essen remained empty. New sisters came to fill the ranks, but none were assigned to the chambers that had belonged to the vanished seven. The rooms were sealed and blessed, transformed into shrines where prayers were offered for souls whose fate remained unknown. Yet, sometimes, on winter nights, when the wind howled around the abbey walls with particular fury, the remaining sisters would swear they heard voices joining their midnight prayers. 7 clear tones that harmonized with their hymns. 7 presences that seemed to lend strength to their devotions, even as they remained forever beyond the reach of mortal sight. The mystery of the vanished nuns became part of Essen's sacred tradition, a reminder that the divine works in ways that exceed human understanding. Pilgrims would come to pray in the chapel where the sisters had last been seen, some seeking miraculous intervention, others simply drawn by the sense that this was a place where the boundary between worlds had worn thin. The empty spaces left by their disappearance became as much a part of the abbey's identity as any relic or treasure. 7 absences that spoke more powerfully than any presence could. 7 silences that sang more clearly than any voice. 7 mysteries that transformed the very air of Essen into something that trembled on the edge of revelation. To this day, scholars debate what became of the nuns who vanished from Essen Abbey on that winter night in 947. But for those who understand that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but lived with, the answer may be simpler and more profound than any investigation could reveal. 7 women gave themselves so completely to the divine that the divine accepted their offering, not through death but through transformation into something beyond mortal comprehension. Their disappearance remains a testament to the terrible beauty of absolute devotion, a reminder that some kinds of prayer are answered in ways that leave the world forever changed, forever marked by the absence of souls who found their way home through paths that lead beyond the maps of ordinary existence. On the muddy plain of Agincourt, where English longbows sang their deadly song and French chivalry died in the October rain of 1415, Henry V carved his name into history with steel and blood. It was a victory so complete, so against all odds, that men would speak of it as proof that God favored the English cause. Yet in the careful tallies kept by meticulous clerks, in the rolls of honor and dishonor that recorded every English knight who lived or died that day, there exists a gap as troubling as any wound: the complete disappearance of Sir William de la Pole from the annals of the living and the dead. The morning of St. Crispin's Day had dawned gray and wet, the kind of weather that turns earth to sucking mud and makes armor feel like a tomb of metal. King Henry's army, weakened by disease and the long march through hostile territory, faced a French force that outnumbered them by perhaps 4 to 1. The flower of French nobility had gathered to crush these upstart islanders, their banners bright with heraldic pride, their lances sharp with righteous anger. Among the English knights who would fight that day stood Sir William de la Pole, a man whose presence should have been as memorable as his courage. He bore one of the great names of England. The de la Pole family had served kings for generations, accumulating wealth and honor in equal measure. William himself was known as a knight of particular prowess, his sword arm tested in the Welsh campaigns, and his loyalty to the crown proved beyond question. Sir John Fastolf, that meticulous keeper of records, had noted William's presence in the army that marched into France. The young knight rode a destrier worth more than most men would see in a lifetime, bore arms that proclaimed his noble lineage, and commanded a retinue of men-at-arms whose equipment spoke of serious preparation for war. He was, by every measure, the kind of knight whose deeds would be sung by minstrels and recorded by chroniclers. But when the battle was joined and the longbowmen began their deadly work, William de la Pole seemed to slip between the cracks of history like mist through fingers. The English deployment was a masterwork of tactical necessity. Henry placed his archers on the flanks, their stakes driven deep into the muddy ground to break any cavalry charge. The knights and men-at-arms formed the center, a thin line of steel that would either hold or see England's cause die in French mud. It was a formation born of desperation and genius in equal measure. Sir William's banner was seen in the early moments of the battle, his distinctive arms clearly visible among the English array. Several witnesses later swore they had seen him in animated conversation with other knights as the French army approached, his bearing confident despite the daunting odds they faced. The French attack, when it came, was everything the English had feared and hoped for. Thousands of mounted knights thundered across the field, their war cries echoing like thunder, their lances couched for the devastating impact that had broken armies from Crécy to Poitiers. But the mud betrayed them, and the English archers' bodkin points found the joints in even the finest armor. What followed was less battle than slaughter. The French cavalry foundered in the mud, their horses stumbling and falling, their riders transformed from mounted gods of war into helpless targets for English arrows and Welsh knives. The famous charge that was supposed to sweep the English from the field became a catastrophe that would haunt French dreams for generations. Yet in all the careful accounts of that terrible day, in all the testimonies of survivors and the rolls of the dead, Sir William de la Pole simply vanished, not killed among the heaps of French dead, not wounded and carried from the field, not captured and held for ransom, simply gone, as if the earth had opened to swallow him. Sir John Fastolf, whose obsession with record-keeping bordered on the mystical, personally interviewed every English knight who survived the battle. He compiled lists of the dead and wounded with the precision of a man who understood that history lives or dies in such details. But when asked about Sir William de la Pole, even the most observant witnesses could provide only fragments, a glimpse of his banner early in the day, a flash of his distinctive armor during the initial deployment, then nothing. The mystery deepened. When Fastolf examined the physical evidence left on the battlefield, Sir William's horse was found among the English baggage, untouched by French raiders, bearing no signs of having been ridden hard or wounded in combat. His tent stood undisturbed, his personal effects arranged as if he had simply stepped out for a moment and expected to return. Most puzzling of all, his sword blade that had been blessed by bishops and was said to contain a fragment of the true cross, lay beside his sleeping roll, clean and unblooded. No knight would abandon such a weapon willingly, especially not on the morning of battle. For Sir William to have left his blessed sword behind suggested either sudden death or flight so precipitous that even honor was abandoned. Yet neither explanation fit the other evidence. As the English army prepared to march back to Calais, loaded with French prisoners and plunder, the absence of Sir William became impossible to ignore. His men-at-arms had survived the battle and waited for orders from their lord. His squire had his armor cleaned and ready. His banner flew from its proper place in the baggage train, but the man himself had become as insubstantial as morning. King Henry, when informed of the mystery, was reportedly troubled beyond what the disappearance of a single night should have warranted. Sir William's family had served the crown with distinction for generations, and his loyalty had never been questioned. The king ordered a thorough search of the battlefield and the surrounding countryside, but even royal authority could not conjure answers from the silent earth. The French prisoners, when questioned, proved equally baffling. Several claimed to have seen a knight matching Sir William's description during the battle, but their accounts contradicted each other in fundamental ways. Some placed him fighting heroically among the English lines. Others swore they had seen him fleeing toward the baggage train. One French count insisted he had personally fought with Sir William and had wounded him gravely, but could not explain why no blood was found on his sword, or why no body matched his description as the English army made its way back to Calais. Theories began to proliferate among the soldiers. Some whispered that Sir William had been struck by divine madness, a punishment for some secret sin that had finally caught up with him. Others suggested more earthly explanations. Perhaps he had been captured by French forces who failed to recognize his value, or killed by peasants seeking revenge for the devastation the English army had brought to their lands. The most disturbing theory came from the Welsh archers, men who had learned their lore in the wild valleys where ancient beliefs still held sway. They spoke of battlefields where the veil between worlds grew thin, places where the intensity of violence and death opened doorways that should remain closed. In their telling, Sir William had not died or fled, but had been claimed by forces older than Christianity, powers that sometimes demanded tribute from fields soaked in blood. When news of Sir William's disappearance reached England, his family's response was as mysterious as the vanishing itself. Rather than demanding explanations or mounting their own investigation, the de la Poles seemed to accept the loss with a resignation that puzzled observers. They arranged no memorial services, commissioned no masses for his soul, made no attempts to recover his body or effects. It was as if they had expected such an end, as if the family had been waiting for a debt to be paid in blood and mystery. The official records show Sir William as missing in action, his fate unknown. But in the margins of Fastolf's meticulous chronicles, added in a different hand years later, appear strange notations that suggest the mystery continued long after Agincourt was won. References to sightings of a knight bearing the de la Pole arms in distant parts of France. Reports from merchants who claimed to have seen him in the service of various lords. Testimonies from pilgrims who swore they had encountered him on the roads to Compostela or Rome. These accounts shared certain unsettling characteristics. The knight in question never spoke above a whisper, never removed his helm in company, and seemed to age not at all despite the passing years. His horse left no tracks in soft ground, his armor bore no tarnish despite constant travel, and his presence brought with it a cold that had nothing to do with weather. Local records from across France contains scattered references to a phantom knight who appeared at sites of battle or bloodshed, sometimes fighting for the locals against bandits, sometimes simply standing vigil over mass graves. Always he bore arms similar to those of Sir William de la Pole, but always he vanished before dawn, leaving behind only the memory of his presence and a sense that some great wrong remained unavenged. The truth of Sir William's fate may have died with the last witnesses to Agincourt, but the mystery of his disappearance became part of the battle's legend. Soldiers would speak of it around campfires, adding their own embellishments to a story that seemed to grow stranger with each telling. Some claimed he had been transported to fairyland as punishment for spilling blood on sacred ground. Others whispered that he had made a bargain with dark powers for victory, and the price had been his own existence in the world of mortal men. Perhaps the most persistent legend held that Sir William had not vanished at all, but had been transformed into something that could no longer be recognized by ordinary sight. In this telling, he remained on the battlefield of Agincourt, standing eternal guard over the place where England's honor had been won at such terrible cost. Visitors to the site would sometimes report seeing a solitary figure standing among the fields where French nobility had died, a knight whose banner bore arms that might once have been familiar, watching over ground that had been consecrated with blood and glory. The mystery of Sir William de la Pole's disappearance serves as a reminder that even in our most documented battles, even in our most carefully recorded victories, there remain spaces where the inexplicable intrudes upon the historical. His vanishing speaks to every soul that has ever wondered about the cost of glory, about the prices that are demanded for the moments when mere mortals touch the realm of legend. Somewhere in the mists that rise from ancient battlefields, somewhere in the space between victory and loss, between honor and horror, Sir William may be walking still, not dead, for death leaves traces, but translated into a realm where knights serve causes that transcend the petty squabbles of nations, where the price of touching glory is to become glory's eternal servant, forever absent from the world that remembers his name only as a mystery written in the margins of history's greatest triumph. In the shadow of Bayeux Cathedral, where stone saints keep their vigil over mortal sins and ancient tapestries tell tales of conquest and glory, there once occurred a miracle so disturbing that the church itself chose silence over celebration. It was during the reign of Duke Richard the Good, when Normandy was still young in its power and the cathedral was new in its magnificence, that a child vanished from the very altar of God, not in death, not in kidnapping, but in a manner that challenged every understanding of how divine grace operates in the world of men. The boy's name was Adelard, though few who witnessed what happened to him would ever speak it aloud again. He was the youngest son of Guillaume de Montfort, one of Duke Richard's most trusted vassals, a child born to wealth and privilege, but marked from birth by a holiness that seemed to shine from his very skin. Pilgrims would travel leagues just to hear him sing the Latin responses. Adelard already showed signs of mystical communion that troubled even the most devout priests. He would spend hours kneeling before the cathedral's great crucifix, his lips moving in prayers that sounded like Latin but contained words that no scholar could identify. Birds would settle on his shoulders during Mass, and candles would burn brighter when he approached the altar, as if drawn to some inner light that his small body could barely contain. The morning of the Feast of the Assumption dawned clear and bright, one of those August days when the Norman countryside seems touched by paradise itself. The cathedral filled early with nobles and commoners alike, all come to witness the celebration of the Virgin's ascension to heaven. Duke Richard himself was present, his ducal crown catching the colored light that streamed through the great windows, his presence lending weight to an occasion already heavy with significance. Adelard served that morning as one of the altar boys, his small figure moving with practiced grace through the ancient rituals. He had been trained by Brother Anselm, the cathedral's most learned priest, in the proper forms of service, and his devotion was so complete that even the Duke had remarked upon the child's extraordinary piety. The Mass proceeded with all the solemnity befitting such a holy day. The incense rose in sweet clouds toward the vaulted ceiling. The choir's voices echoed through stone that seemed to amplify their prayers, and the congregation knelt in unified devotion to mysteries that transcended earthly understanding. It was during the consecration of the host, at the moment when bread and wine become the actual body and blood of Christ, that the miracle began. Brother Anselm had just elevated the sacred elements, his voice carrying the Latin words that had been spoken at countless altars for countless years. The congregation bowed their heads in reverence, their prayers ascending like invisible incense toward heaven. But Adelard, who knelt beside the altar in his white surplice, suddenly raised his face toward the light streaming through the great rose window above. What happened next was witnessed by nearly 1,000 souls, yet no two accounts agree in their details. The light that fell upon the boy seemed to intensify, growing brighter and more golden, until his small form appeared to be illuminated from within. His lips moved in prayer, but the words that emerged were not Latin, not Norman French, not any language known to mortal men. They were sounds that seemed to bypass the ear entirely and speak directly to the soul. The congregation watched in awe as Adelard slowly rose to his feet, his movements fluid as water, his face transfigured by a joy so intense it was almost painful to witness. The light around him continued to grow brighter until those nearest the altar had to shield their eyes. Some later swore they saw the outline of wings spreading from his shoulders. Others claimed that figures of saints materialized around him, reaching out their hands in welcome. Brother Anselm, trained in theology and mystical experience, recognized what he was seeing as either the highest form of divine favor or the most dangerous kind of spiritual delusion. He continued with the Mass, his voice steady despite the wonder and terror that battled in his heart, trying to provide some anchor of normalcy in a moment that threatened to shatter the boundary between heaven and earth. The transformation continued. For what witnesses estimated as the space of 3 Avenue Marias, Adelard's small body seemed to become translucent, as if the light within him was burning away the flesh that had contained his spirit. His face held an expression of such perfect peace that several observers wept at the sight of it, recognizing in that childish countenance something that their souls yearned for but had never seen. Then between one heartbeat and the next, he was gone, not vanished in the sense of disappearing, but gone as if he had never been there at all. The light faded gradually, leaving behind only the ordinary illumination of colored glass and wax candles. The space where Adelard had knelt showed no disturbance, no sign that a human body had ever occupied it. Even his white surplice had vanished, leaving no thread or fragment to prove that the cathedral's most devoted server had ever existed in the physical world. The silence that followed was deeper than any human quiet could account for. 1,000 people sat frozen in their pews, their minds struggling to process what their eyes had witnessed. Brother Anselm's voice faltered for the first time in 30 years of priestly service, the sacred words dying on his lips as he stared at the empty space. Where a child had knelt in prayer only moments before, it was Duke Richard who broke the spell, rising from his place of honor and striding toward the altar with the decisiveness that had made him master of Normandy. His examination of the spot where Adelard had vanished was thorough and methodical, but it revealed nothing beyond the testimony of his own eyes. The boy had simply ceased to exist in any form that mortal senses could detect. The immediate aftermath was chaos barely contained by the sanctity of the setting. Adelard's parents, Guillaume and Matilda de Montfort, pushed through the crowd to reach the altar, their faces twisted with a grief too profound for tears. They fell to their knees where their son had knelt, their hands searching the cold stone for any trace of the child who had been their greatest joy and their deepest worry. Duke Richard, displaying the pragmatic wisdom that made him an effective ruler, immediately sealed the cathedral and commanded that no one speak of what they had witnessed until the church could determine the proper interpretation of events. Guards were posted at every door, and the congregation was required to give their testimonies to scribes before being allowed to leave. The investigations that followed were thorough and troubling. Brother Anselm, despite his own bewilderment, was subjected to intense questioning about his instruction of the boy, about any signs of heretical belief or dangerous mystical practices. The cathedral itself was searched from crypt to bell tower, its hidden passages examined, its walls sounded for secret chambers where a child might be hidden. Guillaume de Montfort's household was thoroughly investigated, his servants questioned about any enemies who might have wished to harm the family, his finances examined for evidence of debts that might have motivated kidnapping for ransom. Every possibility that human agency might explain the disappearance was explored with the kind of thoroughness that desperation brings to investigation. But all earthly explanations crumbled before the testimony of too many reliable witnesses. Duke Richard himself had seen the light, had watched the boy's transfiguration, had witnessed the moment when Adelard had seemed to step out of the physical world entirely. The Duke was not a man given to mystical fancies, but he was also not a man who could deny the evidence of his own senses. The Church's response was swift and decisive in its ambiguity. A commission of learned theologians was assembled to examine the event, but their deliberations were conducted in the deepest secrecy. The official position, when it was finally announced, was that the matter required further study and prayer. The witnesses were advised to speak of the incident only in confession, and then only if they felt it necessary for the salvation of their souls. What the Theological Commission actually concluded was never made public, but rumors leaked from the cathedral chapter with the persistence of water through stone. Some claimed the scholars had deemed the vanishing a genuine miracle, proof that God sometimes called his most faithful servants directly to his presence without the intermediary of death. Others whispered that the commission had found evidence of demonic intervention, suggesting that forces of darkness had claimed the child for purposes too terrible to contemplate. The most disturbing rumors spoke of a third possibility, that the commission had apparently debated at length that Adelard's disappearance represented something entirely new in Christian experience, a form of translation that fitted neither the patterns of sainthood nor the categories of damnation. In this interpretation, the boy had become something that existing theology could not classify, a soul that had evolved beyond the normal boundaries of human existence. Whatever the truth of the commission's findings, the practical result was the same. The event was officially forgotten, expunged from the cathedral's records, omitted from the chronicles that recorded Duke Richard's reign. The witnesses were encouraged to think of it as a dream, a shared vision that had meaning only for their personal spiritual development, but forgetting proved more difficult than forgetting. The empty space where Adelard had knelt seemed to retain some quality of his presence, a cold spot that never warmed despite the Norman sun streaming through the windows above. Candles placed there would burn with unusual brightness, their flames dancing to rhythms that matched no earthly wind. The stone itself began to show wear patterns, as if invisible knees continued to press against it in eternal prayer. Pilgrims began to arrive at Bayeux Cathedral, drawn by rumors that refused to die despite official silence. They came seeking miracles, healing, or simply to stand in the place where a child had touched the infinite and been transformed by the contact. Many reported experiencing visions while kneeling where Adelard had vanished, glimpses of a boy's face shining with impossible light, voices speaking in tongues that conveyed meaning without words. The de Montfort family never recovered from their loss. Guillaume threw himself into military service with the desperate courage of a man seeking death in battle, while Matilda retreated into religious contemplation so complete that she seemed to fade from the world like her vanished son. They never spoke publicly of what they had witnessed, but servants reported that they would sometimes be found kneeling in their private chapel, their lips moving in prayers that sounded like the strange words Adelard had spoken in his final moments. Years passed, then decades, but the mystery of the phantom child of Bayeux refused to rest. Visitors to the cathedral would sometimes glimpse a small figure in white moving through the shadows near the altar, always at the edge of vision, always gone when looked at directly. The boy never aged in these sightings, remaining forever 7 years old, forever caught in the moment of his impossible translation. The cathedral's priests learned to accept these manifestations as part of their sacred charge, neither encouraging belief in them nor actively discouraging those who claimed to have experienced them. The child had become part of Bayeux's spiritual landscape, a mystery that enhanced rather than diminished the cathedral's reputation for holiness. Modern scholarship has attempted to explain the event through various rational means: mass hallucination, political conspiracy, or simple fraud perpetrated by ambitious clerics. But these explanations founder on the testimony of too many reliable witnesses, including Duke Richard himself, whose reputation for practical skepticism makes his account particularly difficult to dismiss. Perhaps the truth is simpler and more profound than any explanation can encompass. In kneeling to serve God with perfect devotion, in opening his child's heart completely to divine love. Adelard may have achieved a form of union that transcended the normal boundaries of physical existence. His vanishing was not death, but transformation, not loss, but elevation to a state where prayer becomes presence, where love becomes light, where service becomes a form of being that no earthly cathedral can contain, that the phantom child of Bayeux remains at his post, kneeling forever in prayer, serving as altar boy to mysteries that exceed human comprehension. His disappearance reminds us that some forms of devotion exact prices we cannot calculate, that some prayers are answered in ways that challenge every assumption about the relationship between heaven and earth. The boundary between worlds remains forever thin, forever marked by the absence of a boy whose love was too pure for mortal flesh to hold. His mystery echoes through the centuries as a reminder that grace operates by laws we cannot fathom, that divine love sometimes claims its servants in ways that leave the world forever changed, forever haunted by visions of what lies beyond the veil of ordinary existence. In the rolling hills of Brabant, where the rivers wind through valleys that have known both peace and war since time immemorial, there once ruled a count whose pride burned as bright as the torches that lit his castle halls. Lambert of Louving was his name, and in the chronicles of his time he was recorded as a man of fierce temper and fiercer ambition, a lord who brooked no slight to his honor and forgave no insult to his house. Yet for all his earthly power, for all the steel at his command, and the walls that guarded his domain, Lambert would vanish from the world in a manner so complete that even his enemies would whisper prayers for his soul. The autumn of 1054 was a season of unusual restlessness in the lands around Louving. The harvest had been poor, the rains too heavy in summer, and too scarce in the crucial weeks before the grain ripened. Peasants spoke in worried voices of omens and portents of wolves seen where wolves should not be, of birds flying in formations that spelled words in ancient tongues, of nights when the stars seemed to dim as if some cosmic shadow passed across their light. Lambert paid little heed to such peasant superstitions. His concerns were more immediate and infinitely more dangerous. The complex web of feudal politics that bound the nobility of the Low Countries had grown particularly tangled that year, with old alliances crumbling and new ones forming with bewildering speed. Several of his neighbors had aligned themselves against him, claiming that his growing power threatened the traditional balance that kept their corner of the Holy Roman Empire from descending into open warfare. Chief among these enemies was Godfrey of Bouillon, that same Godfrey who would later lead the First Crusade to glory and legend. But in 1054, Godfrey was merely another ambitious lord seeking to expand his holdings at his neighbor's expense, and Lambert's rich lands represented a prize too valuable to ignore. The two men had exchanged increasingly bitter words throughout the summer, their rivalry fed by the kind of personal hatred that makes political conflict deadly. It was in this atmosphere of growing tension that Lambert made the decision that would seal his fate. On the feast day of St. Denis, as October's chill began to creep through the forests surrounding Louvain, he announced his intention to ride out with a small party of companions on a hunting expedition. The decision struck many of his advisers as unwise to leave the safety of his castle. When enemies prowled, his borders seemed the height of folly. But Lambert's pride would not allow him to cower behind walls like a besieged merchant. He was a warrior of noble blood, trained from childhood in the arts of war and the chase. To deny himself the pleasures of the hunt because of his enemy's threats would be to acknowledge a fear that his honor could never accept. Besides, he argued, a small party moving swiftly through familiar terrain would be safer than a large force that might attract unwanted attention. The hunting party that rode out from Louvain on that October morning consisted of Lambert himself, his nephew William, 2 trusted knights, and a handful of huntsmen and servants. They were well armed and well mounted, carrying the finest weapons that the Count's armories could provide. Their quarry was the great stag that had been sighted in the forest depths, a magnificent beast whose antlers were said to span a man's reach, and whose capture would provide both sport and symbol of Lambert's mastery over his domain. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that makes the blood sing with the joy of being alive and free. The horses stepped eagerly along the forest paths, their breath steaming in the cool air, their riders confident in their skill and their lord's judgment. If any of them felt unease at the silence that seemed to press in around them as they rode deeper into the woods, they kept such feelings to themselves. Lambert himself was in high spirits, joking with his companions and pointing out landmarks from hunts of previous years. He knew these forests as intimately as he knew the halls of his own castle, having ridden these paths since childhood. Every stream, every clearing, every ancient oak was familiar to him, part of the landscape of his identity as much as the heraldic bearings on his shield. It was near midday when they picked up the stag's trail, the hoofprints clear in the soft earth beside a stream that wound through a grove of beech trees. The great beast had passed this way recently, its massive weight leaving impressions deep enough to suggest it was indeed the legendary creature they sought. Lambert's excitement was palpable as he studied the signs, his eyes bright with the hunter's joy at being close to worthy prey. The trail led them deeper into the forest, following paths that grew ever narrower and more overgrown. The canopy above grew thicker, filtering the autumn sunlight into a greenish twilight that seemed to muffle sound and make distances difficult to judge. Still, Lambert pressed on, his eagerness overriding the subtle warnings that began to whisper at the edges of consciousness. It was William, Lambert's nephew, who first voiced concern about how far they had come from familiar territory. The young man had noticed that the usual landmarks were absent, that the forest around them had taken on an unfamiliar character despite their supposedly following known paths. The trees seemed older here, their trunks massive and twisted into shapes that suggested great age and stranger influences. But Lambert would not be dissuaded. The trail was fresh, the quarry close, and his hunter's instincts told him that the great stag was just ahead, perhaps around the next bend or beyond the next grove. His pride had become entangled with the chase, and to turn back empty-handed would feel like a defeat that his enemies might somehow sense and use against him. The path brought them at last to a clearing unlike any they had seen before. It was perfectly circular, bounded by ancient oaks whose branches interwove overhead like the vault of a natural cathedral. In the center of this space stood a stone that might have been an altar, or might have been something older and less comprehensible, carved with symbols that predated Christianity by centuries uncounted. The great stag stood beside this stone, magnificent and motionless, its antlers catching the filtered light like a crown of bone and ivory. It seemed unafraid of the hunters, regarding them with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. For a moment that stretched toward eternity, man and beast studied each other across the sacred space, and Lambert felt something stir in his soul that had nothing to do with the thrill of the hunt. Then the moment shattered. Lambert spurred his horse forward, his hunting horn sounding the call that should have brought his companions charging into the clearing. But as he urged his mount across the threshold of that circular space, the world around him began to change in ways that made his eyes water and his mind reel with incomprehension. The other members of the hunting party, following close behind their lord, saw Lambert and his horse disappear as if they had ridden into a wall of mist that wasn't there. One moment the Count was clearly visible, his form sharp against the filtered light of the clearing. The next, he was gone, leaving behind only the echo of his horn call and the thunder of hoofbeats that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. William spurred his own horse toward the spot where his uncle had vanished, but his mount shied violently away from the clearing's edge, rearing and snorting as if it sensed some invisible barrier or presence too terrible to approach. The other riders found their horses similarly affected, the animals refusing to enter the space where Lambert had disappeared despite all urging and encouragement. The search that followed was frantic and thorough. The hunting party called name until their voices were hoarse, combed every inch of the clearing and the surrounding forest, followed every stream and pathway that might have provided escape or concealment. But of the Count of Louvain and his destrier there was no trace. They had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. When the survivors finally returned to Louvain Castle, their report sent shockwaves through the region. A search was immediately organized, with hundreds of men scouring the forests where Lambert had disappeared. Dogs were brought to follow scent trails, priests were summoned to bless the search parties and protect them from whatever forces might have claimed their lord. But the great forest yielded nothing except silence and shadow. The circular clearing could never be found again, despite the detailed descriptions provided by the surviving members of the hunting party. Paths that should have led to it seemed to twist away at the last moment, carrying searchers in circles that brought them always back to familiar ground, without ever reaching their destination. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and still no trace of Lambert was found. His enemies, rather than rejoicing in his disappearance, seemed almost afraid of whatever had befallen him. Godfrey of Bouillon, who had been preparing for war against Lambert's forces, called off his planned attack and withdrew to his own lands, claiming that some matters were too dark for earthly warfare to touch. The peasants of the region, with the deep wisdom that comes from living close to the earth and its ancient secrets, spoke in whispers of what they believed had happened. Pride, they said, had carried him into the realm of the old powers, the forces that had ruled these lands long before human kings claimed dominion over forest and field. In seeking to hunt the sacred stag, he had trespassed on ground that belonged to beings who recognized no mortal authority. Some claimed that on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the wind carried strange scents through the forest paths, they could hear the sound of a hunting horn echoing from the depths of the woods. It was Lambert's horn, they whispered. still sounding the call that had carried him beyond the boundaries of the mortal world. He was hunting still, but his quarry now was something that mortal men were never meant to pursue. Others spoke of sightings a rider, glimpsed at the edge of vision, mounted on a horse that cast no shadow, bearing arms that might once have been familiar but were now twisted into shapes that hurt the mind to contemplate. This phantom hunter appeared at sites of conflict and betrayal, they said. A reminder that some forms of pride extracted prices that could never be fully paid. The truth of Lambert's fate may lie beyond the reach of any earthly investigation. His disappearance serves as a reminder that the forests of Europe are older than the kingdoms that claim to rule them, that beneath the veneer of Christian civilization lie currents and powers that predate human memory. In seeking to prove his mastery over his domain, Lambert may have discovered that there are realms where human authority means nothing, where pride becomes not strength but vulnerability to forces that measure worth by different scales entirely. The Count of Louvain rode into legend on that October day, his vanishing a testament to the dangerous thin places where the world of mortal politics touches the realm of ancient mystery. His empty throne served as a warning to other proud lords that some hunts lead not to triumph but to transformation, not to mastery but to mysteries that swallow human ambition as completely as morning mist absorbs the first light of dawn. Somewhere, in the spaces between memory and dream, between history and myth, Lambert may be riding still, pursuing quarry that can never be caught by mortal hunters, serving as eternal reminder that some forms of pride exact prices that echo through centuries, leaving behind only the whisper of hunting horns on wind that blows from nowhere toward nothing, calling seekers toward mysteries they are not equipped to solve. In the harsh mountains of Asturias, where Christian Spain clung to its precarious existence while most of the peninsula bowed under Moorish rule, there lived a hope so precious that it was guarded more closely than gold or sacred relics. This hope had a name, Alfonso, and he was barely 2 summers old when he vanished from his cradle in the year 718, disappearing into a mystery that would haunt the royal house of Asturias for generations and echo through the Reconquista like a song of loss too profound for any ballad to contain. The kingdom of Asturias in those days was less a kingdom than a desperate dream clinging to life in the northern mountains. Paleo, the first king, had won his legendary victory at Covadonga only a few years before, turning back a Moorish army through what the Christians claimed was divine intervention. But one battle, however miraculous, could not drive the Islamic conquerors from Spanish soil. It could only establish a tiny refuge where the old faith and the old ways might survive until God saw fit to restore Christian rule to the lands of Hispania. It was in this context of precarious survival that the birth of Prince Alfonso had been greeted as a sign of divine favor. The child was the son of Duke Peter of Cantabria, nephew to King Paleo himself, and heir to bloodlines that stretched back to the Visigothic kings who had ruled Spain before the Islamic conquest. More than a child, Alfonso represented continuity proof that the royal lines had not been broken, that legitimate rule would someday return to the peninsula. The boy had been born under auspicious signs. If the court chronicles are to be believed, the night of his birth, stars had fallen like silver rain, and a great eagle had been seen circling the tower where his mother labored to bring him forth. Pilgrims claimed that the waters of nearby holy wells had turned sweet as honey, and shepherds spoke of hearing angelic voices singing in harmonies that made their flocks lie down in perfect peace. From his earliest days, Alfonso had been surrounded by guards and watchers, protected not just by steel but by prayers and blessings that were renewed daily. The survival of the Asturian kingdom depended on the survival of its royal line, and this child represented the future of Christian resistance to Moorish rule. His cradle was placed in the most secure chamber of the royal residence. For all the vigilance of devoted protectors, the child vanished as completely as if he had been made of morning mist. The discovery came at dawn, when Alfonso's wet nurse arrived to tend to his morning feeding. Sister Esperanza was a woman of unshakable faith and maternal devotion, who had served the royal household since before Palaio's great victory. She had nursed 2 generations of noble children and was known for her ability to sense a child's needs before the child itself knew them. Her scream when she found the empty cradle, arranged as if he had simply evaporated from within them. The wooden cradle, carved from oak, blessed by bishops, and decorated with protective symbols, both Christian and older, showed no signs of disturbance. Even the soft down pillow on which his head had rested still bore the impression of his small skull. King Palaio himself led the initial search, his face twisted with an anguish that went beyond personal grief. The loss of Alfonso was not merely the loss of a beloved great-nephew, it was the potential end of the dynasty. Every room in the royal residence was searched with desperate thoroughness, every chest and cupboard examined, every loose stone in the walls tested for hidden passages. The guards who had watched the corridors leading to Alfonso's chamber were subjected to intense questioning, but their testimonies only deepened the mystery. They swore that no one had passed their posts during the night, that they had heard no sounds of disturbance, seen no shadows where shadows should not be. Their vigil had been maintained with the same devotion they would have shown in guarding the Holy Sepulchre itself, as news of the disappearance spread beyond the royal residence. The search expanded to encompass the entire region. Every cave in the surrounding mountains was explored, every shepherd's hut examined, every possible hiding place scoured by men who understood that they were searching not just for a missing child, but for the future of their cause. Dogs were brought to follow scent trails, but they seemed confused and frightened, whining and backing away from the empty cradle as if it held some presence too terrible for animal senses to endure. The theories that emerged in the desperate days following Alfonso's disappearance reflected both the political realities of the time and the supernatural fears that lurked in the corners of medieval consciousness. The most obvious explanation was kidnapping by Moorish agents, enemies who had somehow penetrated the Christian stronghold to steal away the heir who represented their greatest long-term threat. This theory had the virtue of political logic, but it foundered on practical difficulties. No Moorish force could have approached the royal residence undetected. Moreover, if the Muslims had taken Alfonso, they would surely have made their possession of him known, using the captured heir as a bargaining chip or propaganda weapon to demoralize Christian resistance. Other voices spoke of betrayal from within, suggesting that some noble or courtier had sold the child to the enemy for gold or promises of power. men who might see advantage in eliminating the next generation of the royal line. But investigations into the backgrounds and recent activities of potential traitors revealed nothing more damning than the usual petty jealousies and ambitions that people whose understanding of the world was shaped by older wisdoms than Christian theology or political analysis. They spoke of the child having been claimed by the ancient powers of the land, forces that had ruled the Spanish mountains long before Romans or Visigoths or Moors had ever set foot on Iberian soil. In their telling, Alfonso's royal blood carried obligations that predated Christianity, debts inherited from ancestors who had made pacts with beings that existed in the spaces between earth and sky, mountain and valley. The child's disappearance was not kidnapping but collection of a debt, where shepherds claimed to have glimpsed a figure that might once have been a child, but had been transformed into something that belonged neither to earth nor heaven. The boy thing was said to appear at moments of crisis when Christian forces faced their greatest trials, his presence a sign that divine protection had not been withdrawn, despite appearances to the contrary. As weeks passed into months, and months into years, the mystery of Alfonso's disappearance began to transform from urgent crisis into enduring legend. Official records speak of the child as having died in infancy, his fate sealed by the harsh realities of medieval mortality. But the ballads sung by wandering minstrels tell a different story, speaking of a lost prince who walks the mountains, still. Service of purposes too vast for mortal understanding. In this telling, his disappearance was not loss but preparation, a necessary exile that would end when Spain had greatest need of the bloodline he represented. The most persistent version of the legend claims that Alfonso was spirited away to the hidden kingdom of Prester John. There he grows in wisdom and strength, preparing for the day when he will return to lead the final reconquest of Iberian lands from Islamic rule. Other stories speak of the lost prince appearing at critical moments throughout the Reconquista, fighting alongside Christian forces under assumed names and identities. Veterans of the great battles that slowly pushed Muslim rule southward would sometimes claim to have fought beside a warrior whose skill and courage seemed almost supernatural, whose knowledge of enemy tactics suggested access to intelligence. No mortal spy could have gathered these phantom sightings, shared certain characteristics that made them particularly unsettling. The mysterious warrior never removed his helm in company, never spoke of his origins or destinations, and seemed to age not at all, despite the passage of years between appearances. His presence brought victory to Christian arms, but he would vanish before the celebrations could begin, leaving behind only the memory of his contribution and a sense that some great mystery remained unresolved. The truth of Alfonso's fate may be as simple as infant mortality, that grim reaper that claimed so many children in medieval times. But the enduring power of his legend speaks to something deeper than mere historical curiosity. His disappearance came to represent every hope deferred, every dream that seemed to die before it could be fulfilled, every promise that history appears to break in vanishing from his cradle. His absence was transformed into a kind of presence, a reminder that some losses are too profound to be final, some disappearances too meaningful to be mere endings. The empty cradle in the royal residence at Asturias became a shrine where prayers were offered not for the dead, but for the mysteriously departed. Whether those prayers were answered by history's slow arc toward Christian victory, or by forces more mysterious than any chronicle records, remains a question that each believer must answer for themselves. In the mountains of northern Spain, where Christian resistance first found its voice and courage, the legend of the lost heir continues to echo. Alfonso's disappearance reminds us that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but lived with. Some vanishings are not endings, but transformations. Some silences speak more eloquently than any words could about the hopes and fears that shape nations and define the meaning of faith in an uncertain world. Somewhere in the space between history and hope, between memory and dream, the child who was destined to be king may be walking still, his absence more powerful than any presence could be. His mystery, a reminder that some stories end not with resolution, but with questions that echo through centuries, calling each generation to decide for themselves what they believe about destiny, providence, and the strange ways that divine purposes sometimes work themselves out in human affairs. In the ancient port of Ravenna, where Byzantine mosaics gleam like trapped starlight, and the ghosts of emperors walk marble halls that echo with the whispers of 1,000 years, there once lived a woman whose beauty was matched only by the darkness of her reputation. Countess Theodora of Ravenna was her name, though whether that name concealed more than it revealed remains one of the city's most closely guarded secrets, buried now beneath layers of time and deliberate forgetting. The year was 998, in the reign of Otto III, when the Holy Roman Empire stretched from the North Sea to the toe of Italy, and Byzantine influence still colored the politics of the Italian peninsula like wine staining clear water. Nominally part of the German emperor's domain, but culturally and spiritually bound to Constantinople, a place where East met West in arrangements that were as beautiful as they were unstable. Theodora embodied these contradictions perfectly. Her wealth was legendary, derived from trading ventures that stretched from the Baltic and never in the hearing of those who valued their safety. The Countess had come to Ravenna 3 years before the mystery that would define, establishing herself in a palazzo that had once housed Byzantine governors, and filling it with treasures that made emperors weep with envy. She entertained lavishly, her salons drawing scholars and merchants, priests and nobles, artists and adventurers from across the known world. Yet for all her apparent openness, there was something about Theodora that kept even her closest associates, or the manner in which conversations would falter when she entered a room, as if her very presence changed the nature of whatever discourse had been taking place. Some claimed she never seemed to age, despite the years they had known her, while others swore that mirrors would not hold her reflection truly, showing instead shadowy approximations that suggested rather than revealed the scandal that would eventually drive Theodora to seek sanctuary in the convent. Began, as such scandals often do, with a love affair that transgressed the carefully maintained boundaries of medieval society. The man was Cardinal Alessandro of Milan, a powerful prelate whose influence in papal politics was matched only by his reputation for austere holiness. That he should do so with a woman of Theodora's mysterious reputation threatened to shatter the already fragile peace between church and temporal authority. Their liaison was conducted with the elaborate secrecy that such affairs required. Meetings arranged through coded messages and conducted in locations chosen for discretion rather than comfort. Such secrets could never remain hidden for long. By the summer of 998, their relationship was the subject of gossip in every palazzo and conspiracy. In every cathedral chapter, Cardinal Alessandro, faced with exposure and the destruction of his career, chose the path of many powerful men confronted with inconvenient truths. He denied everything and cast Theodora as a seductress who had used unholy arts to corrupt his purity. Her known interest in Greek texts that dealt with subjects the Church preferred to keep buried, her collection of artifacts from pagan antiquity that Church authorities, armed with the cardinal's testimony and their own suspicions, descended upon Theodora's palazzo like avenging angels. What they found there provided more questions than answers, but the questions were disturbing enough to seal her fate. Books written in scripts that no scholar could identify, charts that mapped star patterns unknown to Christian astronomy, and objects carved from materials that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. Most damning of all was the discovery of what appeared to be an altar in the palazzo's deepest chamber, a structure that clearly predated Christian occupation of the site but showed signs of recent use. The implications were clear to medieval minds trained to see heresy in every shadow. Theodora had been practicing the old religion, invoking powers that Christianity had supposedly banished from the world. Faced with charges of sorcery and corruption, trading her worldly freedom for the protection that religious vows could provide, agreed to accept her, perhaps swayed by the generous donation she made to their treasury, or perhaps recognizing that refusing sanctuary to a woman of her connections could bring its own dangers. The transformation from countess to nun should have marked the end of Theodora's story, at least as far as the outside world was concerned. Women who entered convents under such circumstances typically vanished from public record, their lives becoming matter for prayers rather than chronicles. But Theodora's story was far from over. It was about to enter its most mysterious phase. For the first few weeks after taking the veil, Theodora seemed to adapt to convent life with surprising ease. She attended the canonical hours faithfully, participated in the community's labors, and gave every appearance of genuine repentance for whatever sins had brought her to religious sanctuary. The other nuns, initially suspicious of this exotic, began to accept her presence, if not entirely welcome it. But those who watched closely noticed troubling signs that all was not as it appeared, as if the space itself had been somehow expanded beyond its physical dimensions. The books she read during recreation periods were not the approved devotional texts the convent library contained, but volumes that appeared to be written in scripts that shifted and changed when observed directly. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that came from her chamber during the deep hours of night, when the convent should have been wrapped in the silence of holy sleep. The words, when they could be made out, seemed to be in languages that predated Latin, tongues that made the listener's flesh crawl with primitive fear. Sister Margaret, the convent's eldest nun and its unofficial chronicler, began to document these unusual occurrences with the methodical precision of a woman who understood that extraordinary events required extraordinary recording. Her notes, discovered centuries later, provide the most detailed account of Theodora's final weeks in the world of mortal women. According to Sister Margaret's testimony, Theodora began to change in ways that went beyond the normal adjustments of worldly women to religious life. Her skin took on a translucent quality that seemed to glow with its own inner light, particularly during the hours of prayer. The physical limits of sight. When she spoke, her words carried harmonics that made listeners feel as if they were hearing multiple voices speaking in perfect unison. The transformation reached its climax on the feast of Saint Michael the Archangel, when the veil between worlds was said to be at its thinnest, and the boundaries between earthly and heavenly realms grew permeable to those who knew how to cross them. Her voice rising and falling in supplications that seemed to be addressed not to the Christian God, but to powers that existed in the spaces between known and unknown. When morning came and the bell rang for lauds, Theodora's voice was not among those that answered the call to prayer. Sister Margaret, accompanied by 2 other nuns, went to her cell to investigate and found a scene that would haunt their dreams for the remainder of their lives. The chamber was empty, but it was not the simple emptiness of an absent occupant. Something essential. Theodora's religious habit lay on the narrow bed, arranged with the same precision that had marked the placement of her secular belongings when she first entered the convent. But the fabric seemed to have been leached of color and substance, as if whatever had once filled it had drawn away not just warmth, but the very essence that gave cloth its reality. When Sister Margaret touched the garments, they crumbled to dust between her fingers, leaving behind only the faintest scent of incense and something else that might have been myrrh, or might have been something older and stranger. The search for Theodora was immediate and thorough, but it revealed only the inadequacy of human understanding. When confronted with mysteries that exceeded the boundaries of ordinary experience, every corner of the convent was examined, every possible hiding place explored, every route of escape investigated. The walls showed no signs of having been breached, the gates remained locked and guarded, and the grounds revealed no footprints or other evidence of departure. Yet Theodora had undeniably vanished, leaving behind only questions that grew more disturbing the longer they remained unanswered. Had she escaped through means unknown to her watchers, fleeing to some distant land where her reputation could not follow? Had she achieved some form of mystical translation, her physical form absorbed into realms beyond mortal sight? Or had she been claimed by the very powers she was accused of serving? Her disappearance, the final payment for bargains made in chambers where candlelight danced with shadows older than Christianity. The official explanation, recorded in the convent's chronicles and reported to church authorities, was that Theodora had died during the night, and her body had been claimed by angels, taken directly to heaven without the intermediary of earthly burial. This account satisfied the requirements of ecclesiastical bureaucracy, while avoiding the more disturbing implications of what the nuns had actually witnessed. But in the years that followed, Ravenna's citizens began to report sightings that suggested a different truth. A woman matching Theodora's description was glimpsed walking the canals at twilight, her form translucent but recognizable, her presence bringing with it a sense of profound melancholy that made observers weep without understanding why. These appearances followed no pattern that human logic could discern, occurring at times of crisis or celebration with equal unpredictability. The sightings shared certain characteristics that made them particularly unsettling. The phantom Theodora never aged, remaining forever as she had appeared in her final earthly days, but her clothing and surroundings seemed to shift between the Byzantine robes of her secular life and the simple habit of her religious calling. She never spoke in these apparitions, but witnesses reported hearing music that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, melodies that combined Christian hymns with harmonies that belonged to older traditions. Modern scholars, attempting to unravel the mystery of Theodora's disappearance, have found themselves confronted with evidence that resists rational analysis. The convent records, preserved in the Vatican archives, contain Sister Margaret's detailed account, but also include margins, notes written in scripts that no paleographer has been able to identify. Chemical analysis of the parchment reveals compounds that should not have existed in medieval ink, elements that seem to shift their atomic structure when subjected to different forms of examination. Perhaps the truth of Theodora's fate lies not in any single explanation, but in the intersection of all possibilities. A woman caught between worlds Byzantine and Western, pagan and Christian, earthly and divines. She may have finally resolved the contradictions of her existence by stepping entirely outside the boundaries that constrain ordinary human experience. Her disappearance serves as a reminder that medieval Europe was a place where multiple realities coexisted in uneasy tension, where the rational and the mystical, the Christian and the pagan, the known and the unknowable existed side by side in arrangements that our modern minds struggle to comprehend. In vanishing from her convent cell, Theodora became a permanent resident of that liminal space, a figure who belongs neither entirely to history nor entirely to legend, but exists forever in the borderland between them. The canals of Ravenna still reflect her mystery, their dark waters holding secrets that no amount of dredging will ever bring to light. In the shadows of ancient churches and the alcoves of Byzantine palaces, her story continues to unfold, a reminder that some disappearances are not endings but transformations. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved but lived with, and some silences speak more eloquently than any words about the strange and wonderful ways that human souls sometimes transcend the limitations of the flesh that briefly contains them. In the mist-shrouded lands of the northern Netherlands, where the Rhine delta spreads its fingers through marshes that have known both Roman galleys and Viking longships, there stood in the year 975 a cathedral that served as beacon and fortress both. Utrecht, the city was called, and its bishop wielded power that extended far beyond the spiritual realm into the dangerous politics of a continent where Christian and pagan, Saxon and Dane lived in the kind of proximity that breeds both conversion and conflict. Bishop Balderic was the shepherd of this flock, a man whose reputation for holy learning was matched only by his skill in the deadly art of diplomacy. In an age when bishops were as likely to carry swords as crosses, when the cure of souls often required the protection of steel, Balderic had proven himself capable of defending his people against enemies, both earthly and spiritual. Yet for all his worldly wisdom, for all his understanding of the complex currents that moved through medieval Europe, he would vanish into mystery as completely as if he had never drawn breath. The Viking raids that had terrorized Europe for 2 centuries were entering their final phase in the year 975. But their ending was not the clean conclusion that chroniclers would later describe. The great age of longships and sudden death was fragmenting into a dozen smaller conflicts, as individual warbands sought to carve out whatever profit they could from a world that was slowly organizing itself against their predations. Some Vikings had settled into the lands they had conquered, becoming farmers and merchants. Others had accepted baptism and service to Christian kings, but a stubborn remnant clung to the old ways, the old gods, and the old profession of taking by force what others had labored to create. It was one of these holdout bands that had established itself in the marshy lands north of Utrecht, a group of perhaps 200 warriors led by a jarl named Hakon, who claimed descent from the Seekings of old. They had built their camp on an island that could only be reached by channels known to themselves, a fortress of earth and timber from which they could launch raids against the rich monasteries and trading towns of the region. Hakon's warriors were not the young heroes of Viking legend, but grizzled veterans who had spent their lives perfecting the arts of war and rapine. They had fought from the Scottish islands to the shores of the Mediterranean, had served as mercenaries for Byzantine emperors and Frankish kings, had seen empires rise and fall while their loyalty remained fixed on simpler things, the weight of silver in their hands, the taste of victory mead, the songs that would be sung around winter fires about their deeds. Bishop Baldric understood these men in ways that many of his Christian contemporaries did not. He had studied their language and their customs, had spoken with those who had converted and those who remained faithful to the old ways. His library contained not just theological works, but the kind of practical knowledge that successful negotiation required: maps of the coastal regions, lists of prominent families and their genealogies, even copies of the sagas that preserved Viking oral tradition in written form. When reports reached Utrecht that Hakon's band was preparing for a major raid against the cathedral and its surrounding settlements, Baldric faced the kind of choice that defined medieval leadership. He could call upon his secular allies for military support, risking a battle that might devastate the region regardless of its outcome. He could attempt to buy peace with tribute, knowing that such payments only encouraged further demands. Or he could employ the most dangerous weapon in a bishop's arsenal, his own person, offered as negotiator and potential hostage in the hope that Christian charity might touch even pagan hearts. Baldric chose the third option, despite the protests of his clergy and the warnings of his military advisors. His decision was based partly on practical calculation. His capture would be worth more to the Vikings than the destruction of Utrecht's wealth, and partly on the theological conviction that God sometimes called his servants to witness faith in the most dangerous circumstances. If his sacrifice could save the lives of his flock, then sacrifice was not just acceptable but required. The party that rode north from Utrecht on the feast of St. Bavo consisted of Bishop Baldric himself, 2 trusted priests who would serve as interpreters and witnesses, and a guard of 12 mounted warriors whose presence was more ceremonial than practical. Against 200 Viking veterans, 12 Christian knights would provide little protection, but their presence indicated that the bishop came as an equal treating with equals, not as a supplicant begging for mercy. The journey took them through landscape that had been shaped by centuries of conflict between different peoples and different ways of life. Roman ruins stood beside Saxon settlements, while Frisian fishing villages dotted the coastal marshes where their inhabitants pursued livelihoods older than any empire. It was country that had known multiple conquests and had learned to adapt, to bend without breaking, to preserve what mattered most while yielding what could not be defended. The final stage of their journey required local guides. These men, fishermen and marsh dwellers, who had learned to profit from their knowledge of the waterways, spoke in worried tones about the Viking camp. The raiders, they said, had been conducting strange rituals in preparation for their planned assault. Sacrifices to the old gods that involved practices the Christian guides preferred not to describe in detail as the bishop's party navigated the final channel that led to the Viking island. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of their boat's passage through reeds that whispered secrets in languages older than Latin or Saxon. Even the birds seemed to have fled this place, leaving behind only the sense of approaching confrontation. Hakon's camp, when it finally came into view, was an impressive testament to the organizational skills that had made Viking raids so devastatingly effective. The island had been fortified with earthworks and timber palisades that would have done credit to a professional military engineer. Longships were drawn up on the muddy shores, their dragon prows gleaming with fresh paint and their hulls showing the scars of battles fought across half the known world. The Vikings who met Bishop Balderic's party at the landing were men whose very presence spoke of violence contained but not eliminated. They wore their weapons with the casual familiarity of craftsmen who had spent lifetimes perfecting their deadly trade. Their eyes held the kind of wariness that comes from surviving in a profession where momentary inattention meant death. Yet they received the Christian delegation with the formal courtesy that warrior cultures reserve for brave enemies. Jarl Hakon himself was a man who embodied the twilight of the Viking age. His beard was white with the wisdom of years, his arms bore the scars of 100 battles, and his eyes held depths that spoke of seas sailed and lands conquered across the breadth of the known world. He received Bishop Balderic in a hall built from timbers taken from churches the Vikings had burned, its walls decorated with shields and weapons that told the story of a lifetime spent in service to gods who demanded proof of valor in blood and steel. The negotiations that followed were conducted with the careful ritual that medieval diplomacy required. Both sides understood that they were not just discussing terms for peaceful coexistence, but were engaged in a deeper conversation about the nature of power, faith, and the ways that different worldviews might find accommodation in a changing world. Balderic spoke not just as a bishop, but as a representative of the new order that was slowly establishing itself across Europe. Hakon responded as the guardian of traditions that refused to die quietly, even as the world that had given them birth was passing away. For 3 days and nights, the discussions continued. Bishop Balderic remained in the Viking camp, sharing meals with men who had spent their lives killing Christians, sleeping in a hall where pagan gods were openly honored, conducting himself with the kind of courage that won respect even from enemies. His arguments were not based solely on Christian theology, but drew upon the practical considerations that men of war could understand the changing nature of European politics, the decreasing profitability of raiding, the advantages that might come from alliance with established authority. The breakthrough, when it came, seemed to offer hope that violence might indeed be avoided. Haakon expressed willingness to consider terms that would end his band's raiding in exchange for recognition of their territorial claims and regular tribute payments. The details would require further negotiation, but the foundation for agreement had been established. Bishop Balderic prepared to return to Utrecht with news that would bring joy to his people and glory to his own reputation. But on the morning of the fourth day, when the mist rose thick from the surrounding marshes and the world seemed wrapped in veils of gray and silver, Bishop Balderic simply vanished. His escorts found his sleeping place empty, his belongings undisturbed, his episcopal ring and cross lying beside his bed, as if he had simply stepped out of his mortal flesh and departed for realms unknown. The Vikings, questioned with urgent intensity, swore that they had heard nothing unusual during the night, seen no figures moving through their camp, detected no signs of struggle or stealth. The search that followed was immediate and thorough. Every corner of the island was examined, every building searched, every possible hiding place investigated. Boats scoured the surrounding channels, and divers plunged into waters that might have concealed a body weighted with stones. But of Bishop Balderic there was no trace, as if he had been absorbed into the mist itself. Jarl Haakon's reaction to the disappearance was as mysterious as the event itself. Rather than pressing his advantage or claiming that the bishop's vanishing released him from any agreements they had reached, the old warrior seemed genuinely disturbed by what had occurred. He ordered his own men to join the search, threatened dire punishment for anyone who might have harmed the Christian negotiator, and eventually called upon his personal skalds to consult the runes for guidance about what had befallen their guest. The runic consultation, according to the Christian priests who witnessed it, yielded results that troubled even men who had spent their lives reading omens in blood and bone. The stones spoke of journeys between worlds, of prices paid to powers older than gods, of debts collected by forces that recognized neither Christian nor pagan authority. The skalds advised Haakon to make offerings to whatever had claimed the bishop, not in celebration, but in propitiation, seeking to avoid bringing similar attention to themselves. The breakdown of negotiations following Balderic's disappearance led not to the expected Viking raid, but to something stranger and more disturbing. Haakon's warriors began to report unsettling experiences, dreams of a figure in episcopal robes walking among their longships, sounds of Latin prayers echoing across the marshes at hours when no mortal voice should have been speaking, visions of crosses appearing in the wake of their boats as they traveled the familiar channels. Within weeks of the bishop's vanishing, the Viking camp began to dissolve. Warriors who had followed Haakon for decades started to slip away in the night, seeking service with other lords or simply disappearing into the anonymous masses of medieval Europe. Those who remained grew increasingly nervous and quarrelsome, jumping at shadows and finding omens of disaster in the most ordinary events. Haakon himself seemed to age years in the space of months. The vital war leader who had commanded respect across the northern seas became a man haunted by questions he could not answer and fears he could not name. His final recorded act was to order the burning of his own longships, destroying the vessels that had carried him to glory across half the world. Shortly afterward, he too vanished, leaving behind only ashes and memories. The official records speak of Bishop Baldric as martyred by pagan raiders. His body never recovered, but his sacrifice, sanctified by the church and commemorated in the cathedral he had died attempting to protect. But among the people of Utrecht and the surrounding regions, other stories began to circulate. Baldric had been taken by the ancient powers of the marshlands, forces that predated both Christian and pagan traditions and recognized no distinction between bishop and warrior when it came to claiming their tribute. Others whispered that his disappearance had been voluntary. Bishop Baldric continued his mission in a form that death could not touch, appearing to Vikings throughout the northern seas to offer them the choice between conversion and destruction. Ships that had sailed out under pagan banners would return flying Christian crosses, their crews claiming to have been visited by a bishop whose eyes held the depths of eternity and whose words carried the weight of divine authority. These phantom encounters followed patterns that made them particularly unsettling. The ghostly bishop never appeared in storms or battles when supernatural intervention might be expected, but during moments of calm when crews had time to contemplate the meaning of their lives and the direction of their choices. His message was always the same, that the age of the old gods was ending, that the future belonged to those who could adapt to new realities, and that mercy was still available to those who sought it with genuine hearts. Modern historians studying the collapse of Viking power in the Low Countries have noted the unusual rapidity with which raiding activities ceased in the years following Bishop Balderic's disappearance. Economic and political factors certainly played their part, but the speed and completeness of the transformation suggests influences that purely material analysis cannot fully explain. Perhaps the truth lies not in any single explanation, but in the recognition that medieval Europe was a place where the boundaries between different kinds of reality were more permeable than our modern minds easily comprehend. Bishop Baldric's disappearance may have been simultaneously political necessity, spiritual mystery, and divine intervention, existing at the intersection of multiple truths rather than conforming to the limitations of any single interpretation. His vanishing serves as a reminder that some sacrifices transcend the circumstances that occasioned them. Some negotiations continue long after the negotiators have departed the earthly stage, and some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but experienced as ongoing encounters with forces that exceed human understanding. In the mists that rise from the marshlands of Utrecht, in the channels where longships once carried their cargoes of violence and change, Bishop Baldric may be walking still, forever offering choices that could transform not just individual souls, but the course of history itself. The silence of his disappearance speaks more eloquently than any martyrdom could about the strange and wonderful ways that divine purposes sometimes work themselves out in human affairs, leaving behind not answers but questions that each generation must engage according to their own understanding of what it means to serve something greater than the narrow boundaries of mortal existence.